So I'd like to welcome you all here today. My name is Mary Warner. I'm Executive Director of the Morrison County Historical Society. You'll see a lovely brick fireplace behind me, and that is the image of our Brick by Brick series. This is a three-part series, and today's series is funding the upkeep of existing buildings, the Little Falls Redevelopment Program. So in putting together Brick by Brick, building community development through history, we wanted to create this series to explore the concept of history as the infrastructure for a community. We build upon what has happened in the past, whether building on successes or avoiding what didn't work. The Morrison County Historical Society has been a resource for much of the building preservation work done in the Little Falls Downtown Historic District, providing history and photos on buildings for surveys, the National Register application for the district, and design guidelines. It's the sort of work that historical societies are quietly doing all around the state, perhaps a little too quietly. As we were meeting with today's presenters to organize the Brick One program, Little Falls City Administrator John Rademacher surprised me with another bit of history serving as infrastructure. He revealed that the program he and Carol will be discussing today was based on the Little Falls Heritage Preservation Commission's loan grant program for restoring the facades on buildings in the historic district. This is history as infrastructure in action, one program building on another, brick by brick. The Little Falls Heritage Preservation Commission itself was also informed by history. When former city admin Rich Carlson was investigating starting the HPC, he turned to Jan Warner, former executive director of the Morrison County Historical Society, as an advisor to get that going. Brick by brick, history serves as the foundation for further community development, and it starts with the Native community. We are living on land in central Minnesota that is the traditional homeland of the Ojibwe and Dakota people. Southern Minnesota, where we have folks joining us for this series, is the homeland of the Dakota. There are currently 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota. Their historical use of the land continues to impact land use to this day, serving as the original history infrastructure that upholds all community development now and in the future. With that, I would like to turn this over to our moderator, who is Amy Pekarski from Sourcewell, and she's going to help introduce the rest of the folks on our panel today, and we will get going. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. I'm excited to be moderating this important discussion at the intersection of historic preservation and community development. Today, we have a very talented and committed group of professionals and leaders who have made an impact in their community. Their experience will provide some insight and opportunity for you to take back to your own communities. Before I introduce the speakers, I want to share just a few housekeeping items. This is part one of a three-part series. This session and the other two will be recorded. We have muted everyone for today's session, and we ask that you use the chat function to ask questions. The chat feature is in the lower right-hand corner. If there is time, we will welcome a few questions at the end of each presentation. Otherwise, we have allocated time at the end of the 4 presentations for questions and answers. Also, on the upper right-hand corner, there is an option to use different views. So since we are sharing a slideshow and there will be presenters, you may want to just play with those options and see what works best for you. Our first speaker is going to be Greg Zilka. Greg has served as mayor of Little Falls since 2014. Previously, he served 2 years on the city council and 9 years on the Little Falls Board of Education. Currently, he is the president of the Economic Development Authority, chair of Rural Development Finance Authority, and the North Central Economic Development Authority Board, and serves on the Morrison County Community Development Board of Directors. He is a lifelong resident of Little Falls. Our second speaker is Carol Anderson. Carol has served as the executive director of the Community Development of Morrison County for 32 years. In that capacity, she oversees $2 million revolving loan funds that are directed towards manufacturing, nonprofit, and retail businesses in Morrison County. She is the chair of the Workforce Development Board for Region 2, sits on the Rural Minnesota Concentrated Employment Program Board, and serves on the Governor's Workforce Development Board and the Executive Committee of the Minnesota Association of Workforce Boards. She's also chair of the Minnesota Farmers Union Executive Committee and serves on the Minnesota Rural Finance Authority in the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Our third speaker is John Rademacher. John has been the city administrator of Little Falls since September 2015 and previously Madison, Minnesota, starting in 2010. John has a master's degree in public administration from the University of South Dakota and has been a member of the International City County Managers Association since 2008. Our final speaker is Mary Ippel. Mary is a member of the Public Finance and Economic Development Group at Taft Law and practices principally in the area of bond law, municipal finance law, tax increment financing, housing and redevelopment authority law, and economic development authority law. She has counseled her clients in hundreds of development projects, including the drafting of appropriate project and tax increment development and tax increment agreements and financing options, both bonded and pay-as-you-go status. Now, I will turn things over to Greg to get us started for today.
Thank you, Amy. Good afternoon. As Amy said, I am Greg Welcome. There are three traits that I believe in their communities: passion, trust, and connectivity. The ability to connect with residents, business owners, staff, and other communities. All three are relevant to today's topic, funding the upkeep of existing buildings. I spent 42 years in retail, of which the last 28 years were as a store director. My office was in the middle of the store, so I was very visible and accessible to all. Our store also partnered with many local businesses, schools, and nonprofits. My wife and I owned a business where I had the opportunity to connect with even more people. I love our community and have a passion for helping and serving others. For the last 30 years, I've been a member on numerous boards locally and throughout the region. This year will be my 7th as mayor. When I became mayor, many locals were comfortable with sharing their ideas, their thoughts, and their concerns. After a couple of years, I heard concerns about our downtown: empty buildings, buildings in need of major repairs, some that may even be demolished. I even heard someone say our downtown is dying. Not acceptable. Then they dropped a big one. And I believe this is the point that stimulated our Little Falls redevelopment program. They said, why does the city give so much to our new businesses that come to town and so little to existing businesses? Great question. So I went to City Hall and discussed those concerns with Lori Casilla, the city finance officer, and she agreed. She said we can and should do something now. Lori and I brought our plan to John Rademacher, Carol Anderson, and Economic Development Authority Committee. After a couple of meetings, plenty of research, and much discussion, we agreed on a program to fund the upkeep of our existing buildings. You'll hear details from the next presenters. Many thanks to Lori and Carol for their previous work that helped the EDA accrue significant federal and state funds to support this plan. I would be remiss if I did not recognize and thank the EDA committee members: Brad Hercock, Jeremy Hanfler, Mark Gerby, and Bob Reinitz. Also, thanks to John, Lori, and Carol for your work and your great support. Because of this redevelopment program, we are not only upkeeping existing buildings, but we are also saving them. We are keeping existing businesses and helping create new ones. Passion, trust, and connectivity. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Greg? They can send them in the chat. not having any questions, we can turn things over to Carol.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here today. I've been around Little Falls for over 30 years. Built up a revolving loan fund of when I came to from 200,000 to over 2 million now. And when we wrote some of the loan programs that we got, we specifically wrote them so that we could use the funds to help manufacturing. All communities want to do that. But to help retail as well, and to help nonprofits for hard assets. With retail, I think we are one of the few cities in the state that we can use our loan funds to help businesses with, in addition to the program that you're going to see later on here. When I came here, it didn't take me long to know that I have to learn how to think like a banker. And once you do that, you understand what you're able to do in a community. Bankers maybe don't want to fund a downtown project. And you have to understand why. Banks are governed and regulated by the bank examiners that are under the Federal Reserve Bank. And they have to follow the rules, or they could lose their charter. And that's one thing you certainly don't want your local bank to do, is to lose their charter and leave your community. There'll be another empty building. And so one of the most important rules that bankers have is they can lend based on the loan to value of the property. So, and that's the appraised value of the property. So we're going to be flipping through some pictures here of the J.C. Penney building in Little Falls, and that's one of the better ones that we had. Now, how can you tell what a building is valued at? A good place to start is to go to your county in your county tax records and see what the appraised value is. That's county appraised value. So if you're going to be dealing with a bank, they'll bring in a special appraiser to come in and actually look and appraise the building, and then they'll go off of that. But this building, let's just use what the county has on it. The J.C. Penney building is appraised by the county for tax purposes at $104,800. So loan to value. Loan to value is 70%. Is the max the bank can do. So therefore, the max the bank can lend by regulation, $73,360. The buyer has to come up with 30%, or $31,440. That's just to buy the property, okay? Flip through a couple of pictures here. This building isn't really in too bad of a shape. It was the former J.C. Penney building. It was used for kind of a computer fixing type business that worked with systems all over the country, and they did it remotely. You can see the roof here. We'll get back to the roof in a little bit. And then the owner wanted to sell it, and the business had moved out. He had an empty building. I think he was trying to sell it to begin with for $250,000. So he wasn't able to sell it. Part of the reason was, what's it going to take to fix it up? But loan to value. The building was not going to appraise at $250,000. He tried, I'm thinking probably 5 years trying to sell it and couldn't do it. Finally, he came up with the idea that he would donate it to the city. And he'd have to do that at appraised value. And then he would be able to write that off as a donation on his income tax. So the city agreed to take it. And the issue with that building is to replace the roof is $120,000. Now you replace the roof, you're going to have a building that's probably worth $110,000, $120,000. So what do? The roof is worth more than the building. And then when you get into it, you can see the roof is bad here. Flip through a couple of more pictures. Then what are you going to do when you have it? You got to bring it up to code. So you're going to have electrical, handicapped bathrooms, plumbing, HVAC on top of the roof. Not to mention any flooring, sheetrocking, and as many businesses in small towns, there's no parking. So it was a very tough sell. The city had it for, a few years. They tried to, sell it. They even had an estimate of what it would take if we tore the thing down. It has a basement. I think the cost for demolition was over $500,000. So we didn't want to do that. It has historic value. But what did happen was we had somebody that came in and the city sold the building for like $1 or $10. They were then able to go out and through our program, we're helping them with funding the roof. They're putting a lot of sweat equity into it, and they're going to open up a new business. So this is a 3-story building. They're just going to be on the main floor. The upstairs is really rather pretty if it were cleaned up a little better. It used to be an old ballroom up there, and so that's room for expansion for their business. So the issue here is, our group can help with some funding, but it's loan money that community development has. But the city program has been designed to help with the fix-ups like this. So you all have those types of buildings. The other problem that you sometimes have is that you may have a business owner that has the building and they're operating their business out of it. They can't find anyone to purchase the business or the building. That's their retirement. In this case, the person wanted $250,000, for a building. That was their retirement. And when you can't get that, that impacts their retirement considerably. So, you've got your blue sky that you need to fund. And who funds that? In some cases, your local development groups might do it, but you all come back to collateral when it's loans. Grants are tough to come by. So it's very difficult, but we have been successful. And we have a lot of activity. When we started this program, we've done a lot of roofs. We've done a lot of flooring and toilets and windows and all that good kind of stuff. And what we do is we have them fill out an application, find out what they need to do, and then we start directing them to these various programs that we have. The HPC, my program, the EDA, maybe SBA to help with the business. So we have to, quilt all of that together to help. So with that, I will end. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And John Rademacher can then talk about how our program works.
Thank you, Carol. Let's see if any questions come in, but I can, if you can, Amy, if you can get to my part of the presentation, I can kind of talk about what Carol said, stitching together this quilt of different resources. So when I came to Little Falls, I came from a smaller town, Madison, Minnesota, also having a historic downtown, and we dealt with a lot of these same challenges and struggles there. And the fortunate part when I came here versus what we had in Madison was that we didn't have these funds at our disposal right away. In the last year that I was there, our last budget cycle, we actually started specifically carving out tax dollars or general fund dollars to transfer to the EDA to basically build up a fund to finance this exact same work. So When this started, and we knew that it was pretty early on in my time in Little Falls that we saw this building coming to us, and it wasn't without consternation that the EDA took the J.C. Penney building as a donation. It was a challenging decision. It was because, like we said, we knew it was going to be a difficult situation, and that was we accepted the building at the end of 2016, and it's just now in 2021 that we actually have our next owner. We have a development agreement, and we're in the process of closing on that property. So it's taken a number of years. Carol and I and Lori, as Greg mentioned earlier, have been with multiple potential developers or end users of the property over those years, and looking at it, and every single time we come back to this daunting task of how do you come up with the resources in order to make sure that this can that you can get a project done, because it's unless you have the capital yourself and you're in some ways altruistic, where you're willing to put a lot of money into something without the expectation of a return, you're not going to get this. You're not going to make these projects happen. The banks aren't going to be able to make these projects happen, as Carol mentioned, with the restrictions that they're under. Even our programs, where we gap finance that difference in which the banks are maximized to, our traditional loan programs don't work because we still need collateral to invest to it. So taking off of the mayor and Lori's idea, how do we help these buildings? Because they need more than what traditional financing is able to provide. So taking a lead from our HPC, a program that has been in existence now almost 30 years in Little Falls. They were funded primarily with some grants, but have had revolving loans and general fund dollars from the city of Little Falls that have gone in to help their funding resources. They have a loan and deferred loan program that provides very low interest loans and deferred loans. And when I say deferred loan, just basically think grant that is earned over years of ownership. So they will be able to finance different parts of a historic building. So unfortunately, their work only extends to the outside, the front facades, windows, doors, and then the roof. So they can only finance projects that exist in those areas, as well as have to be part of the historic district. So, but their programs are very handy because they can fund things and provide principal to the project for that owner and developer that they don't otherwise have access to. So the structure of their program was that you would take your project, whatever it was, it could be the roof, it could be windows, it could be a combination of all of it. Apply to the HPC. They would make a determination of whether or not that the project was going to meet the characteristics of the historic guidelines. And if it did, then you could move forward. So you could go through, let's say, a $50,000 renovation of your facade with windows or part of the roof. And of that $50,000 of your project, 60% of it would be a low interest loan with a 0% payback during its first 5 years. And then it would go up 1% each year after that up until year 10. The 30% of that program would be the deferred loan portion. So this is the principal forgiveness or grant. So each year that you own the building after your loan approval, 10% of the 30% of your project is forgiven. So if you sold the building in year 5, you would still owe 50% of the 30% of the cost of the project. The remaining 10% is an equity portion that the owner needs to bring to the project, so that you need to be able to show or prove that you have some financing. So this is stuff that doesn't get collateralized, other than for the HPC. If you're doing a facade, they would require a facade easement so that you make sure you maintain the historic guidelines. And then we also have a housing redevelopment authority. That's a taxable authority that allows us to do work that's for residential projects. This would also fit within some of the buildings that we have in our historic downtown because they have apartments. There's no deferred loan portion with theirs, but they would do some low interest loan portions with some other resources. But most importantly, we knew that there's still a gap between what the HPC could fund. Not every building has residential, so we needed to create this redevelopment program that could help mostly, with work that needed to happen on the interiors of buildings. So that's where the redevelopment program came in. And that's why when we created this, we needed to find a way to fill those final gaps in some of our projects. And if you could continue on to the next slide, I'll show you some examples of where we ended up working. Yeah. So if you can move on to the redevelopment slides, Amy. Kind of touched on the HPC already. Okay, so there, back one more. Okay, so here's some of the things that we would be able to fund. As the mayor said, as Carol said, there's challenges with old buildings, especially meeting modern standards, and how those improvements are going to be financed is going to be extremely challenging because you may need to do ADA compliance and providing restrooms or building, improving your plumbing or electrical into a building, and that work is going to have very little impact in the bottom line for the assessed value when that project is done. And it's something, fixing the floors or painting the walls or even putting pipe in the building for the plumbing purposes or electrical. That is not collateralized. Those items can't be collateralized. So you can't use that as equity when going out for a loan through a private lender. Because you can't take the paint off the wall once it's on there. And you're not going to rip out the plumbing to pay for it if the project goes south and the lender needs to recoup some of their original investment. So we really opened the door pretty wide for a lot of potential uses because in the end, these are very risky things, but it was the intent of the EDA to say we need to make some of these investments, we need to take some of these risks, and we need to be able to give our developers, our building owners, business owners, opportunities to fund projects that are going to make sure that their buildings are going to be successful in the future. So you can move on. We then created we knew also, and this is partly a really strong part of working with the mayor and Lori in their history in the city and their involvement in the EDA, we found that a lot of people were really hesitant to participate in our programs because it seemed that they were afraid of the paperwork. So we wanted to create this program to be very easy to access and have a very important opportunity to have a helping hand with Carol to guide people through their work. So we have a one-page pre-application form that you can fill out and basically check some of those boxes because there are some things of the program that we're not going to fund. We will not fund demolition. We will not fund acquisition of the property through these dollars because in the end, we want to save as much of the buildings as possible. We want to make sure that they're important. Some of the other aspects of questions that we ask is that we may have opportunities for other resources through other programs that could help finance this. So it isn't just strictly about you check a box and automatically is going to kick you out of the program. It actually is the opposite. You check that box and we're going to find additional resources for you. So that's where we work with Carol, and we partner with Carol as well to help offset some of her costs with that in the EDA. So these grant applications or these pre-applications, the people that work with that, we pay Carol a fee to help them guide through that project. So when you're done with this portion and we move on to the next loan, it's going to be like a 2 or 3 page application that you're ultimately completing to get access to the dollars. So Amy, if you can move on, I think I got kind of an example of a project that we did. So early on, we had a couple buildings that were kind of ripe for work. They were there was an owner slash developer that was working on this, and they had end users that they were going to lease the spaces to. So in downtown Little Falls, that would be what today is now the Shops of Little Falls, and this is, it's been many years now, and you can see some of the successes that we've been able to achieve in both those buildings. But they had the same struggles that you've seen in the pictures with the JCPenney building, where there's a lot of work that needs to happen inside of those buildings that we can't find loan funds for. So working with the developer slash owner, we were able to identify what parts of this project might be eligible for our funds, and create the program and work with them very closely to say, we recognize that you as your end owner, you're going to be in charge kind of all the aspects of the project. You're going to hire the contractors, you're going to pay the bills, but we are giving you some significant resources to help with that project. So you need to be kind of working with us and open with us, at least in sharing some of the information of what you're going to do. But we're not going to tell you that you have to work with X contractor, or you have to ensure that you have all various competitive bidding, or the other federal regulations, because bottom line for us, the way this program works is because it's strictly local dollars that we put into this program. There are no federal dollars, there are no state dollars in these funds, because that would come with restrictions, that would come with different requirements that we knew are going to make these projects even harder to complete. And we were running, and honestly, we were running out of time for some of these buildings to be able to, without the use of these dollars, they would fall into further disrepair and eventually not be salvageable. So working with them, those were our first two projects that we were able to get done through this format, and have been really good successes for us. Both are operating really well today. And then I think at this point we have had, I want to say 15 projects, and we originally set aside, and this was another credit to Lori and Carol and their long-term visioning. We had some state funds through the MIF program, I think Minnesota Investment Fund program. Carol can correct me if I'm wrong on that. That were returned to the city when our Larson Boats plant sold to Wabash, and I think that was around $500,000. The EDA at that time was receiving the funds back, and they were coming without restrictions. They were going to be turned over to us to use in any local economic development purpose that we deemed eligible. So they decided that they were going to utilize $250,000 of that $500,000 to fund the deferred loan portion of this work. The other loan portion is actually funded out of our revolving loan, our local revolving loan dollars, which we do have some pretty substantial work. So when we started this, we looked to that HBC model to structure the loan program. So we have a very similar setup. We have that 60% low interest loan. Now it doesn't start at 0, it starts at 1%. And then we have the 30% deferred loan. So we do forgive that portion over the years of ownership. And then what we found is that most of the time there is the 10% equity is in the fact that these projects require way more work than what is just being funded in our redevelopment dollars. There may be windows or facades or other things that we're not financing that are necessary projects that are getting done, and we'll count that towards the equity portion because there's value in that owner or developer, using their own money to fund other parts of the project that may not just be eligible. So it ends up being the projects end up being a lot more significant than what the loans get drafted to, but we do fund parts of the project that otherwise you're not going to find access to that capital. I think if you go through, and then it's just that we make sure that you start your project, you start with Carol. And here's the other key pieces to why our programs have been successful is that we do have Carol. We do have Carol available to us, and we do have the mayor who has been incredibly accessible for those business owners to reach out to. He talked about trust in his introduction, and it's truly the trust that they have with him to say, hey, this is a program really intended and designed to help you. we want you to access it. We want you to be able to make your project successful. We want you to be operating in our downtown or any commercial property in Little Falls. That's the other aspect of our redevelopment funds, is that the EDA said this can't just, we don't want this just to be solely for our downtown. We want to be able to make sure that other business areas in town, commercial areas in town have access to this too, because while they may not be in the historic district per its definition, they may have the same problems that we're dealing with. We have buildings that are not in our historic district that have age problems, that have accessibility problems, that have plumbing and heating problems or electrical problems, that are going to run into that same challenge of finding access to these resources to be able to fund their projects. So it was really critical that we said we weren't going to restrict this to just our downtown or just the historic district, but make it available for all commercial property, because there wasn't another resource for them to utilize. So it's with that partnership and with that help that has been the proof for our success. And I would advise that anybody that's looking into starting programs like that you make sure you have some people that can dedicate the time and energy to work with these business owners, because they need that help, and they need that assistance, and they need that trust in us from the government perspective to say, we want to help you, we want you to succeed, and we're going to work with you and help you and guide you along that way, versus saying, hey, we're going to, here's the application, fill it out, and if you miss a dotting an I or crossing a T, you're going to get a rejection. That's not the way we want to do it.
John, we did have a few questions come in.
Sure.
If a community doesn't have a Heritage Preservation Commission, how would they get started with this process?
Yeah, and I think that's where we're going to have Mary Ippel on next, and she's going to kind of talk about how some of these processes start, and if there's still more need to answer that question, I think we can touch on that on the end and save that for the end.
Okay, and then one more. Do you feel one of the stable ways to fund a revolving fund program is through EDA and/or HRA tax levies?
Yes, I would generally say yes, because the challenges you run into if you're trying to start up those funds with just grant dollars is you are going to find that grants come with restrictions, or they come with very specific purposes that they can be utilized for, because they're likely coming from the state or a federal resource, and they have standards and guidelines and requirements that they need to meet in order to deliver those grant funds. Having it under the local funds and having them come from levy dollars opens up the opportunities that you have for their utilization. You still will have to, if this is coming from tax dollars, you still will have to follow the public purpose expenditure guidelines or laws that the state of Minnesota has. If you're in the state of Minnesota, you still have to follow those. But for economic development purposes, for HRA functions, those levy dollars have a lot broader opportunities to be able to utilize those funds.
Thanks, John. That was the last question we had that came in so far, so we will turn things over to Mary then.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to talk about state authority for Minnesota in terms of promoting redevelopment of existing buildings and other economic development purposes. Now, I'm going to be speaking from a political subdivision standpoint, meaning what powers do local political subdivisions have to promote redevelopment and economic development. Now, cities have substantial powers in economic development and redevelopment, and there's also the ability to establish, you've heard references to housing and redevelopment authorities and economic development authorities. I'm going to get into that a little later. But one of the most important things that have to be addressed is you can have all the powers in the world to undertake redevelopment and economic development, but unless you have a funding source to promote that, it's powers without muscle. It always comes back to dollars. What dollars can be inserted into a project to make them happen? In a perfect world, we'd like businesses and corporate USA, America to take care of all of our development and economic development projects, but that's just not the case. It involves, in many instances, especially in redevelopment, local government assistance and subsidies. So I'm going to go in through a number of options for coming up with the ability to fund these programs. I can't highlight enough how important tax levies, contributions from either the city, if you're dealing with the city, or if it's a county dealing with the county. Everybody hates to talk about taxes, but taxes drive projects. So to the extent that you, meaning you, the county or the city, can include in their annual tax levy a source to be dedicated to redevelopment and economic development, that goes a long ways with creating buckets of money to assist projects. Tax levies, of course, are controversial. Local people hate to raise taxes because of all the issues related to raising taxes. So there's some other things that the statute does allow for under Minnesota law, and one of them is tax increment financing. Under the concept of tax increment financing, the taxes that are generated by the existing building or the existing site continues to be paid to the outstanding taxing jurisdictions, which is generally the county, the city, the school district. Now, if our focus here is redevelopment of existing buildings, the base value that the county has on the value, the taxes generated by that continue to be paid to those 3 subdivisions. The taxes generated by the redevelopment can be captured and utilized for the redevelopment assistance. Now, unless you are doing substantial renovation, it may or may not increase the market value of the building upon completion of the renovation. Therefore, tax increment financing may not be of a significant assistance if the market value does not significantly increase because of the redevelopment. But if it does, the difference between the existing taxes based on the current condition of the building and the taxes to be generated based on the redevelopment of the building can be captured by the entity creating this tax increment district, which would either be the city or a county, and that can be used to assist the project in its redevelopment efforts. Now, under the tax increment financing law, you can go to the next slide, you have to create a particular type of district in order to be able to use tax increment financing. And I'm highlighting 2 of them because our mission here is existing buildings. So one type of district is a renewal and renovation district. It's an area that you have to establish which identifies buildings within that area, and they have to meet a particular standard. First of all, 70% of the area of the district has to be improved. That is usually never a problem in a downtown area. 20% of the buildings within this area have to be structurally substandard, and 30% of the other buildings require substantial renovation or clearance to remove existing inadequate conditions. That type of district, you can collect the taxes based on the redevelopment for a period of 16 years. Now, if we are speaking of only one building that we may be utilizing, then this statute doesn't work because there's only one building and we need multiple buildings for a renewal and renovation district. So the next statute or the next district is a redevelopment district. There you again have to find that 70% of the area is improved by buildings, streets, or utilities. Again, never a problem in a downtown area. And 50% of the buildings are structurally substandard, greater than 50% greater than 50%. So if you got one building, you're going to have to find that building structurally substandard. If you got two buildings, you're going to have to find them both. If you've got more than two buildings, then you just go to the math of it. And on that type of district, you can collect the increment for a period of 26 years. Again, tax increment financing is only going to capture the increased market value because of the redevelopment. And unless that is substantial market value increase, tax increment financing may not be the vehicle that is most effective. Now, the next slide that I'd like to discuss is tax abatement. There is a statute that allows you to abate taxes on parcels that you identify after a public hearing. Now, tax abatement is a bit of a misnomer. With tax abatement, you think, oh, they're not paying taxes. That's not the case. If you establish a tax abatement area, the taxes generated from the parcels identified in the area can be retained for purposes of the tax abatement law. For example, promoting redevelopment, financing redevelopment expenses for a potential project. What the statute provides is that the city uses, actually what you do is you calculate the taxes on the property. And it can, unlike tax increment, it can include the existing taxes of a particular building. So let's say we have a building that generates $1,000 of taxes a year. We can, and the taxes after the abatement may be $1,200 a year in our hypothetical. The city can adopt, after a public hearing, a tax abatement area. It includes in its annual tax levy the $1,200 generated by the property. The property owner pays his property taxes in the normal course. But the $1,200 generated from the taxes on this redevelopment property can be retained by the municipality establishing this district and used to assist the developer to reimburse for costs of the redevelopment. The maximum term of an abatement is 15 years, and each political subdivision decides whether it's going to participate. If the city participates, it can do a 15-year abatement. If they ask the school or the county to participate and one of them says no, it can extend to a 20-year period abatement. If all three participate, you have the best of all worlds, and again, your limit is 15 years. But each political subdivision controls its fate, meaning the city can abate its share of the taxes, the county can abate its share of the taxes, the school district can abate its share of the taxes, but whether they abate or not is the approval process for each of the political subdivisions after a public hearing. So abatement, when you are renovating and redeveloping existing buildings, may be more helpful than tax increment, in that you can abate the existing taxes. So you don't just have to look at the increase in value. The difference, however, is with tax increment, if a city creates a TIF district, it collects everybody's increment. The city, the county, and the school district based on the increased value of the property. Here, under tax abatement, each political subdivision makes the decision or not whether to participate and utilize the taxes. So if the city has a project that it's going to use abatement for, and the county and the school district say no, you're only going to capture the city's share of the taxes. But to the extent that you have a project that the county or school district feels strongly about, they may participate. So the good news is you can capture the existing taxes based on the current value of the project. The bad news is you can only make the decision for your own political subdivision. And sometimes we see tax abatement teamed with tax increment, where the first period is the tax increment period, and then the last period is the tax abatement period. But those are two vehicles that allow the capture of taxes from an improved project to be used for purposes of economic development or redevelopment. Now, we heard references to other development authorities, which is the next two slides. The cities and counties have the authority to do economic development, redevelopment on their own. They have the ability to establish the tax increment districts, the tax abatement areas, but the state law also grants the ability for two other political subdivisions, actually three, and I won't get into one of them as port authorities, but those we don't see authorized unless it is done by special legislation. And all the powers that you need to promote housing, redevelopment, and economic development are contained in these two statutes. The first statute is the Housing and Redevelopment Authority law. Any city can establish an HRA provided that you have a public hearing and make a finding that the HRA is necessary. The goals and powers of an HRA relate to housing and redevelopment. You don't necessarily need blight, but you need a goal is the prevention of blight. So housing and redevelopment authorities have been in the law for many, many, many years. There are a lot of cities that have housing and redevelopment authorities. Sometimes they are more geared to just housing, Section 8 housing programs, and they don't want to venture out into redevelopment, even though they have the authority to do that. Economic development authorities, that statute, I think, was introduced in the 80s. And the reason it was introduced was, I mentioned port authorities. The Seaway Port Authority of Duluth and the St. Paul Port Authority were very successful port authorities that had a lot of visibility in Minnesota. Many cities decided they wanted to have port authority powers. They'd go in and ask the legislature to be granted port authority powers. I think there may be 30 or 40 cities that have port authorities. This legislature got tired of the requests, so they prepared an authority called an economic development authority, which is basically a similar authority to a port authority. They granted that authority to all cities and counties in the state. It again requires a public hearing and adoption of a resolution and the establishment of an economic development authority. The one primary difference between an economic development authority and the port authority is that port authorities have the ability to issue general obligation bonds. Economic development authorities do not have the ability to issue general obligation bonds. So economic development authorities have economic development goals. They also can undertake redevelopment and housing. So if you have a housing and redevelopment authority, you have the ability to undertake all these redevelopment projects if they're so inclined to do it. If you don't have an HRA, you might want to establish an EDA as opposed to an HRA, because an EDA has the ability to do what an HRA can, which is redevelopment and housing And an economic development can do both of those along with economic development. So if you are not going to have the city be the engine here, and for example, in Little Falls situation, they have, they've involved all their entities and all their loan programs, and they find it very successful having all three entities involved. I guess if you don't have the Little Falls model in place, you have to decide, are you going to grant these powers to the city, or are you going to create either an HRA or an EDA? Then a mention was made about tax levies. The HRA law and the EDA law allow for a levy, and that levy is laid out in that slide that is up on the screen. Now, depending upon the size of your community, that levy can be very small. It is, for an HRA, it can't exceed 0.0185% of the estimated market value of the city. For an EDA, it can't exceed 0.01813% of the estimated market value of the city. So you have to do the math based on the size of your city to see what that levy authority actually generates in terms of dollars. That's why I, at the beginning of this, mentioned the city including in its general tax levy a levy for contribution to either the EDA or this HRA, or using it for redevelopment purposes, are very beneficial besides these two levies. One other thing I would add is on the HRA levy, the city consents to the levy, but it's actually levied by the HRA. On the EDA levy, the city actually levies it. That's a distinction that becomes important when levy limits are in place. Now, the good news is we haven't seen levy limits on cities for a number of years. But if there is a city levy limit and you are at your maximum, that levy for the EDA counts against the maximum because it's levied by the city. The HRA levy is not counted against the city's levy limit if those come into play. Now, an EDA actually can levy both. It can levy the HRA levy, which would be used for housing and redevelopment purposes, and it can levy the Economic Development Authority levy, which can be used for that plus economic development. So I think that is the end of what I was going to discuss, unless anybody has any other questions for me.
We don't have any questions for you, Mary, but we did get one in earlier for Carol. Carol, would you say that one of the most important functions of your organization is to just connect people with the right development resources?
That's one of them, and you know, and actually the right resources for the right project that actually have some funding that can help with.
Question for any one of our presenters today. How does one go about starting an HPC?
I think the best way to start would be, unless Mary, you might know, but I think you probably start with the State Historic Preservation Office. There's a state area and then there's also national. So you'd have to start with those areas. John, do you know anything more about that?
Yeah, since the HPC is something that's been here for a long time, I'm not familiar with how the entire history of how they started it, but I see we do have a board member that I don't know if Camille has been on since then, or Mary, if you.
I don't know much about housing or historic preservation commissions. What I was talking about in terms of general law does not necessitate a housing preservation commission. That may be helpful for promoting redevelopment, on a local level, but the powers that I talk to, you can do all of those without having such a commission. And I've never really ever looked at how I would assume it's a nonprofit corporation, or I might be totally wrong.
Ours is a commission chartered by the city, and really its alignment for our projects it's just another tool in the toolbox for money. As Carol said, it all comes down to what dollars can you put into the project, and our HPC, as mentioned, we take a dedicated general fund dollar amount and fund the HPC every year so that they can build up their revolving loan pool to use for projects that meet that eligibility requirement that they have. So for us, again, I love Carol's analogy of stitching the quilt together, because it really is. It's so many different pieces that can really help make projects come together.
I think you see good references put in the chat from Michael Coop from the State Historic Preservation Office. That might be a good place to start.
Mm-hmm.
And I think going on in your series, you're going to be talking about historic tax credits. That goes to, if you're in a national historic district, you might be eligible for some national tax credits. So, and it always helps, I think, to have a historic preservation commission there to lead the way.
Mm-hmm. If I could, I just want to touch back onto a little bit of the, presentation and some of the strategies here. As when I came to Little Falls, I was coming from a community that didn't have a lot of resources, so we were trying to build those up. We had our EDA was created, but we didn't have dollars going into it and a significant portion, so we knew it was going to take some time. So if you're in a position where you are in a community and you have a building in your downtown and it's falling apart, like what we talked about are not the immediate responses. These things take some time to get established. They take some dollars. And as Mary Ipple mentioned, the cities can do this work too. So if it's important for the city to engage in that work, you don't need to go and create an EDA or an HRA. Those are really long-term solutions. It's something that you should be looking at to say, hey, we want to create this. We want to build up its revenue streams over time so that we can put those dollars to use. And we also have the revolving loan funds that can be really successful, because you're taking money, borrowing it out, returning those as those dollars are paid back. You can leverage those against other projects. So don't feel that you're only our presentation is saying, it's focused towards those EDAs. We utilize those because they were in existence. They were there. They had resources. We were in a fortunate position to be able to do that. But if you're one of those that is looking for some solutions today, like don't exclude your city or county from being able to potentially help that even if you don't have an EDA established. If it's a priority area, you can use it.
The instances, it comes down to the city, because the counties, they have many cities within the boundaries of the city or the county, and they don't want to be too involved in specific projects. So in my experience, 90% of the time, projects are city driven as opposed to county driven.
Certainly. Our engagement with the county and their economic development arm have been on very large projects, and we usually have multiple partners. Carol very much is involved in that.
Right.
And we've even gone so far as to partner with the Initiative Foundation and their economic development arm. As you heard, Greg, our mayor, has been on multiple economic development regional boards. So he's been a part of those. So in Region 5, they have what's called NCEDA. So that's their economic development arm. So we've had projects that we might be bringing in 4 or 5 different gap funders to help make sure a project's successful. Because back to Carol's point at the beginning, you can only get so far with a private lender, and we don't want to preclude private lenders. We want them to be at the table. We want them to be a part of the project because they're important as well. They're usually the ones that are, helping us on the front end, and Carol as well, to vet to make sure the viability of the project. Because I've had so many tours of our JCPenney building with people that have this grandiose, wonderful idea for a project, but it's going to take millions of dollars in order to make it happen. And that's just not something that's likely going to be fundable, even with leveraging 4 or 5 different gap financiers on the project. And I got a question too. Do we use USDA grants? I believe we have had some USDA programs, but my knowledge right now of the USDA Rural Development Program and the grants are that they're limited based on there's an ultimate fixed cap of like $55,000 on a grant, and that some of that is lower based on your population size. So,
John, I'll interrupt you. Our funds from community development, where we got a lot of money, was from USDA Rural Development, their intermediary relending program. That's where we got the money that we can make loans to manufacturing, retail, or nonprofits. Yes, there is some USDA money available, and certainly in the housing area as well, for city waste treatment plants, those kinds of things. But ours is typically for more retail and manufacturing. It all depends on how you write the program, like I said in the beginning. Most communities just do manufacturing with it. But we said, let's do it differently and let's try to help retail. So that's why the city can come in and do the historic stuff. We'll come back in and help them with the inventory for the business or equipment for the business. So those are things we can do, and we step in to do some of that. USDA is a very good resource.
We did have an additional question come in. If your city has a historic district listed on the National Register and you do not have an HPC, are you saying that the EDA would take on the responsibilities for preserving in that designated district?
Well, the EDA can provide some assistance if they have levied a tax to be either loaned or granted out, or the city has contributed funds to the EDA, but the EDA wouldn't be responsible for historic preservation.
yeah, I think that would fall within the rules of whether your preservation district is nationally recognized or state recognized or locally recognized, and you would have guiding ordinance authority on what are the characteristics that you need to preserve within those different level. So we actually have 2 different districts. We have a national recognized district and a local one. But the rules are the same. We just adopt the same rules. So I think, yeah, as Mary said, I don't think the EDA is the authority to say that you have to preserve based on these guidelines, but they would be a resource to be able to fund projects. But you still need to follow the guidelines of whatever jurisdiction is governing that designation. And I know I see in the chat our contact information is shared, and really our purpose around this is to provide more information. We worked long and hard and have seen some really good success with this. You know, and we want to see this replicated in other communities. If you have the means and the desire to do it, we want to be able to provide you you know, our assistance and being able to help you develop your own programs. It really is critical, you know, and at the point where, you know, I've seen the connection. We saw this as a start in my previous community, and we're seeing it here. We're a piece of the puzzle, but you also need that developer or that building owner. They need to have a major interest and stake at this as well. Cities are what we really struggled with for the JCPenney for a lot of years was finding that end user, because we weren't ultimately going to try to redevelop that building into something, because we didn't want to create something that was then going to, you know, eliminate or take away opportunities for that end user to be able to utilize the property the way that they wanted to do it. It was just, you know, that was, to us, it was going to be a struggle, but we needed to take ownership to maintain that preservation, because the last thing we wanted to see ultimately was a $500,000 parking lot that we didn't even have paved, because we had to tear that building down, fill in the hole, and bring it back up to grade on a really important historic building in the middle of a block in our historic district in our downtown. And you know, that to me is really some of the best opportunities that local governments, you know, whatever financing resource that you have, that you're going to help with projects. That's the important aspect, is that we can be part of that preservation, because, you know, we're going to have the means to sustain some of those projects for a long time.
And I would add that community development in Morrison County and Little Falls have a tremendous working relationship and have been very successful at working together and promoting redevelopment and new projects. And they are to be commended.
I got another couple of other questions in the chat. One that talked about nonprofits, and I'm remiss to mention this too. We will use our redevelopment dollars to fund nonprofit that own our building. In Little Falls, we actually have Great River Arts, which is a nonprofit 501c3. They own a building that they operate their art center out of, and they did a redevelopment grant deferred loan program with us under these dollars. So that is another piece of it that we will have. So yeah, we will. I should have mentioned that before. You know, so we will be able to help with that. So it isn't strictly just private, commercial, or industrial, you know, projects that are economic development in nature.
We did the same thing with our funds. I mean, we helped do a nursing home with some of the equipment inside for the kitchen and the beds and all that. We helped an employment group for handicapped individuals. We helped them build their building, finance that. So yeah, we will do hard assets with nonprofits.
Excellent. Amy, have you seen any other questions come in?
No, Mary, I haven't had any other questions come in.
Okay. So I think on that note, we'll end just a little bit early here. And I want to take the time here to thank all of our presenters. So Mayor Greg Zilka, John Rademacher from the City of Little Falls, Carol Anderson from Morrison County Community Development, and Mary Ipple from Taft Law. as well as Amy Pekarski as our moderator from Sourcewell. Behind the scenes, we have Anne Marie Johnson and Grace Duxbury from the Morrison County Historical Society, Phoebe Ward, fellow from the City of Little Falls, and also Ashley Zeiden, who helped from Sourcewell get our program going. I want to thank everybody who is in attendance today. We have two more parts to our BRIC series, BRIC 2 and BRIC 3. Next week is BRIC 2, and we'll be talking about the historic tax credits. And then BRIC 3 is on the 15th of April, and that will be about history as infrastructure. And so we hope you can join us for that. We will be sending out an email just after this to all the attendees and making slides from today available, as well as contact information for our speakers, so you can follow up with them if you have more questions, which hopefully you do. And then you can get in touch with us too at the Morrison County Historical Society. So I want to say thank you again for everybody for joining us.